My name is Richard Middleton, and I teach biblical studies at Northeastern Seminary and Roberts Wesleyan University in Rochester, New York. You may know me from some of my writings, like my book on the creation of humanity to be the image of God, called The Liberating Image, or my book on a holistic eschatology, the Bible's vision of God's desire to redeem and renew creation, called A New Heaven and a New Earth, or my most recent book, Abraham's Silence, on the importance of lament prayer in times of difficulty and suffering, in which I ask the question, why didn't Abraham lament and protest when God told him to sacrifice his son Isaac? You might even know the two earlier books I wrote with Brian Walsh back when I was living in Canada, our introduction to a holistic Christian worldview called The Transforming Vision, and our application of this worldview to life in a postmodern world, somewhat whimsically called Truth is Stranger Than It Used to Be. Last year, my wife and I were the hosts for a group of folks from our seminary, faculty, staff, students, and alums, along with many friends of the seminary, who went on a trip to the Holy Land, Israel and Palestine. Our teacher from the Jerusalem Center for Biblical Studies was Bobby Morris, a pastor who also teaches courses in Hebrew and Old Testament. I functioned as an adjunct instructor for the trip. I supplemented Bobby's expert guidance around the land of Israel with background information from the Bible to fill in various details. I'd like to share with you some reflections about our trip to give you a bit of a flavor of what we encountered. I've entitled my reflections, Holy Places, Holy People. I especially want to think about the significance of the trip. Why visit the Holy Land? In what sense is it holy? And how does a short trip like this impact our ordinary lives in the world? So I invite you to join me on this journey of reflection as I share some pictures and video of a few fascinating sites we visited, along with relevant scriptures, especially as I think theologically about this visit to the Holy Land. My subtitle is Reflections on a Pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Initially, I hadn't thought of using the term pilgrimage, but as we were getting ready for the trip, I sent out a number of emails to those registered to help us get prepared for the weather, what to wear, what to pack, etc. And I started one of these emails with, Dear fellow pilgrims. Well, I immediately received a response from Jim Othius, pictured here with his wife, our villa, at Caesarea Maritima, one of the sites we explored. Jim was a doctoral supervisor for my PhD studies, and he was the oldest person on the trip. He was delighted with the term pilgrims and replied immediately to my email saying that it seemed entirely appropriate. In fact, it gave the trip a whole lot more significance. It turns out that many years before, when my wife and I were dating, we would read through the poems in a book by the now famous Christian poet Lucy Shaw. The book was called Sightseers into Pilgrims. It may be that the title of this book was always in the back of my mind. It was the first book of really good, not sentimental Christian poetry I ever read. A number of times in the Bible we find the phrase from Dan to Beersheba to describe the entire extent of the Holy Land, from Dan up in the north, near the lush area of what we today call the Golan Heights, to Beersheba in the south, in the dry and arid Negev desert. Well, we visited both Dan and Beersheba and many places in between, including all these listed on the map. I'm going to touch on a few of these places, especially seemingly holy places, and talk about their significance. I'll start with Jesus' visit to a particular well in Samaria, mentioned in John chapter 4, and I'll end there too. This will be a sort of inclusio, coming back to the beginning. In John 4, Jesus visits a Samaritan city called Sychar. Now, most biblical scholars think this is the same place as Shechem in the Old Testament. This is a place that Abraham visited in Genesis 12, and he built an altar there. It's what in later times became the area called Samaria under Roman rule in the time of the New Testament. Now, Shechem, or Sychar, is near Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, two mountains the Israelites encountered soon after they crossed the Jordan from east to west to enter the Promised Land. The blessings and curses of the covenant were pronounced from these two mountains. Now, Sychar was near a plot of ground that Jacob gave his son Joseph. You can see the connection with Abraham, his grandfather, who had been at Shechem. But we are also told that Jacob's well was there. Now, this particular well is not mentioned in the Old Testament, but by the time of Jesus, a tradition had arisen about this particular well. We visited Jacob's well in the modern city of Nablus. Today that's in the West Bank, part of what is called Palestine. Back then it was in the province of Samaria. Many pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land are more traditional than historical. They're associated with an event in the life of Jesus or the Old Testament, but that association may have started centuries after the event, so we're not quite sure if it's accurate. But some places have a claim to be historically accurate, and this is one of them. A well, after all, doesn't move around, and this well had been in continuous use for 2,000 years since the time of Jesus. So whether or not this well was actually used by Jacob, the term Jacob's well might be traditional only, it seems to be the same well at which Jesus met the Samaritan woman. So there was Jesus, tired out from his journey, sitting by the well. It was about noon. It must have been hot. A Samaritan woman came to the well to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." The woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jesus answered, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman responds, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water, gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." Well, I have drunk from the living water that Jesus gives, and it is the best drink you can ever have. But I have also drunk from the water from Jacob's well. You fill the cup from the bucket and you pour some in your hand and take a sip. It's cool and fresh. So that's Jacob's well, an actual historical place in the life of Jesus. And such places, historical or traditional, become places of pilgrimage today, visited by thousands, if not millions of pilgrims. Today there is a Greek Orthodox church that's built over Jacob's well. The well is in the basement of the church. In a moment, I'll touch on a few other places in the Holy Land, but here I want to highlight the physical contours of the land itself. This is a cross-section of the land. It's defined most clearly by the Rift Valley that runs from north to south. Northward along the valley is the Sea of Galilee. Further south is the Dead Sea. They're joined together by the Jordan River. To the east of the valley is contemporary Jordan. To the west, near the Dead Sea, you have the wilderness of Judah, where you'll find the fortress of Masada and Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. We visited both of these sites. Then the land rises to the hill country of Judah, where Jerusalem is. That's why they say you go up to Jerusalem. And from there the land slopes down through the Shephelah to the coastal plain, here called the plain of Philistia, since that is where the Philistines lived in Old Testament times. We had a chance to go to the Sea of Galilee on a boat. This sea is also known as Lake Tiberias and Lake Kinneret. The Hebrew word kinnor means harp or lyre, and I guess that people thought the shape of the lake was harp-like, though I didn't quite see it. But the name predates aerial photography, so maybe they were seeing its shape from a nearby mountain. One day for lunch we had the St. Peter's fish, a particular species of tilapia from the Sea of Galilee. It's best to eat it whole, head on, pick the flesh off the bones, the way Middle Eastern people like to eat. After our boat trip, as we got off the boat and started walking along the pier that led from the boat to where our bus was waiting, I was walking with Jim, my doctoral supervisor, and we were noticing the rocks and scrub along the path. "It's so ordinary," Jim said. "This is the Holy Land, but it's just dirt and plants. It is so ordinary." And our teacher Bobby was fond of saying, that God meets us where we are. That's what the incarnation is about. God comes to us in our ordinary lives. He came to an ordinary place, Israel, in the first century, and made it extraordinary. One of the aspects of the land of Israel that everybody who visits notices is that it is a very rocky land. There are rocks everywhere you go, whether it's the wilderness of Judea near the Dead Sea, or in Samaria in Palestinian territory, or in Galilee further north. Even pasture land is filled with rocks. It's not unusual to see cattle grazing in a field full of rocks. You can understand then that one way the Israelites could take a dig at the immensely powerful Babylonian Empire was to contrast two types of building materials. We have good Israelite stone, but the Babylonians, well, they have to make mud bricks for building, sun-dried bricks for domestic buildings, and kiln-fired bricks for monumental buildings. That's where it says they have to fire them thoroughly. Now, the reason for their inferior building materials is that Babylon lies on the alluvial floodplain between and around Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There was no naturally occurring stone or rock in the area, so what else could they use? Here is a monumental building, the great ziggurat of Ur, built of baked mud bricks. Now, a ziggurat is likely the tower referred to in Genesis 11, a stairway from heaven for the gods to descend to the city in order to bless and protect it. But Israelites used stone for building, whether it was mikvahs for ritual washing like these at Qumran, or stone for domestic dwellings. There was so much of it around. At least they built the lower part of their houses out of stone. The upper parts would have been wood. Some buildings were even constructed right on bedrock. Here is one of the caves at Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls are found. This cave is solid rock. This is cave 4, where a major scroll of the book of Samuel was found. Since I'm writing a book on Samuel, I have to consult the variant readings of certain passages found in that scroll. It's often a bit different from the standard Hebrew text we have, known as the Masoretic text. Knowing something of the physical contours of the Holy Land can help us understand even the images that Jesus used in his teaching, like when he compares people who act on his words to a wise man who builds his house on rock. Even though the house was subjected to rain, floods, and wind, the house withstood the elements because it was founded on solid rock. We're all used to thinking of Jesus as a carpenter based on the traditional translation of the word tekton, a word related to technology or technician. The word really means craftsman or builder, and given the nature of building materials in Israel, Jesus was most likely a stonemason while also doing carpentry too. That's what the Israelite building trade involved. One of the places we visited was a temple that Jeroboam built at Dan up in the north. Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom after the nation was split into two as judgment for the sins of Solomon. We're told in 1 Kings 11 that God was angry with Solomon for his covenant disobedience. So God told him that he would tear the kingdom from him and give it to his servant Jeroboam. Yet God postponed the judgment until Solomon's son Rehoboam, who was even worse than Solomon. God also said that he wouldn't take the entire kingdom from Rehoboam, but would leave one tribe, Judah, which seems to have also included Benjamin. 2 tribes became the southern kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital, while the other 10 tribes became the northern kingdom of Israel, or Ephraim, with Samaria as its capital, though it wasn't the capital till some years after Solomon's death. But Jeroboam had a problem. He was worried that if the people of the 10 northern tribes went to the temple in Jerusalem to offer sacrifices, their loyalty could begin to shift back to Rehoboam and the Davidic kingdom in the south. So he made 2 golden calves, probably intended as pedestals for Yahweh, Israel's God, to stand invisibly on. The Ark of the Covenant, which was in the Jerusalem temple, was thought to be God's footstool on earth. God was seated on his throne in heaven, but he touched down in the Jerusalem temple. But Jeroboam didn't have the ark, so this was his equivalent. plus a calf, probably a bull, was a symbol of strength or power already in Canaanite religion. Jeroboam set up 2 temples with the calves, one in Bethel in the south and the other at Dan, way up north. But just like the golden calf in the time of the Exodus, this became an occasion for idolatry. We visited the archaeological site of Jeroboam's temple at Dan. Here we are approaching the outer courtyard of the temple. Exodus has instructions about making an altar, that is, an edifice for sacrificing animals to God. It's supposed to have horns on each of its corners. The altar at Dan would have been quite large. This is a reconstruction of its probable size based on the base, which has been uncovered, and they actually found one of the horns in the excavations. The altar may have looked something like this, though with a flat surface on the top. Altars could be built of earth or of stone, but Exodus specifies that if stone is used, it should be simply found rocks, not hewn stone. Archaeology has shown that most altars, not all, in the southern kingdom were made of earth or found stone, and it's hard to tell if they had horns. In the northern kingdom, most were 4-horned altars built of hewn stone. This is a 4-horned altar found at Beersheba, so it's an exception to the southern altars. It's made of hewn stone. It's also, therefore, against the regulations of the Torah. You can see the size of it because I'm standing beside it. Exodus also said that there shouldn't be steps going up to the altar. This is probably because Israelite altars were to be distinguished from Canaanite high places, like the one found at Megiddo. This pagan altar was made of found stone, just piled rocks, but it is huge, much taller than a person, so it needed steps. Since the altar at Dan was so large, it also had steps, which went against the law of Moses. So, we have the temple at Dan, built by Jeroboam, an unholy place. Archaeologists have also found a small temple at Arad in the south, near Beersheba. Unlike the temple at Dan, it may have been a legitimate place of worship. The temple was in an Israelite outpost in the Davidic kingdom. It was a small fortress meant to defend the southern border of Judah. The temple was likely constructed for the use of soldiers who were stationed at the fortress far away from the Jerusalem temple. You could think of it like a chapel, except that there would have been sacrifices offered on an altar in the courtyard. There was also a Holy of Holies, a very small inner room at the back of the temple. You can see 2 incense altars at the entrance of the room with square tops. Since they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant, there were these standing stones or matzevot, singular matzevah, in the Holy of Holies. 2 of these were attached to the back wall. They may have symbolized the 2 stone tablets with the 10 Commandments on them, which were kept in the Ark of the Covenant in the Jerusalem temple. We saw only one of the standing stones the day we were there. The other was in the Israel Museum. Now, standing stones could be used to symbolize God's presence, as when Jacob set one up in Genesis 28, and he called it Bethel, the house of God. If there were 2 standing stones, some think that they may have represented Yahweh and his consort Asherah. If this was a symbolism, it was clearly idolatrous, and so this would not be a legitimate temple. Yet, military correspondence found at the Arad fortress mentions only Yahweh and no other gods. A really important archaeological site we visited was at Caesarea Philippi. This was a city built in honor of Caesar by Herod's son Philip. Any city named Caesarea, and there were quite a few, was in honor of Caesar, the title of the Roman emperor. We're told that when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." At Caesarea Philippi, known today by its Arabic name Banias, there is a pagan worship site dating from the time of Jesus. It was focused on the worship of pagan gods, especially the god Pan, from which the name Banias comes. Statues of various gods were placed in alcoves in the cliff wall. But the main feature was a large cave mouth known as the Grotto of the god Pan. The cave is very deep, and it was thought to go down to the underworld, to Hades. A stream used to flow out from the cave mouth. It was thought to have originated in the underworld, maybe a tributary of the river Styx. Sacrifices were thrown into the stream, offerings to Pan and the underworld gods. The stream is now diverted, and you can stand at the cave mouth and look way down. The question is, why would Jesus come to this pagan site? Well, as a good Jew, he probably didn't go directly to this site, but he came into the district of Caesarea Philippi. And in this district, Peter answered the question about who he was. "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Now, Jesus was certainly playing on the name Peter, which means rock or stone. But could Jesus have been intentionally alluding to the rock face at Caesarea Philippi, a visual illustration of his point? But not only on this rock I'll build my church, he goes on to say, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And there, at Caesarea Philippi, were the gates of Hades. Could Jesus have been using the very landscape of Israel as a visual object lesson? Yes, this was an unholy place, but it illustrates the rock-solid, holy nature of the church, the people of God, that Jesus was founding. As Martin Luther wrote in his famous hymn, "A mighty fortress is our God, the prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure, one little word shall fell him." And that word is the Messiah, the Word made flesh. We visited many other significant sites in the Holy Land. Some were simply traditional pilgrimage sites, but many were likely historical, since churches were built on these sites as early as the 1st century. So there was a genuine historical memory there of an event. And over the centuries, other churches were built, and some destroyed and some rebuilt. Till today, we may have a contemporary church on that site. Plausibly historical sites included the Basilica of the Annunciation, built over a 1st century home in Nazareth, likely the house that Mary grew up in, where an angel may have appeared to her. The Church of the Nativity, built over a 1st century cave in Bethlehem, where animals would have been kept near to a house. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over an actual tomb cut from limestone rock, which was part of a burial ground just outside 1st century Jerusalem, so it fits Golgotha very well. We also visited a newly excavated 1st century synagogue at Magdala in Galilee, and since Jesus preached throughout the synagogues in Galilee, he may have stood on the floor right here to deliver his message. Well, there's one more place that I haven't said much about, the Jerusalem Temple, the holiest place of all in ancient Israel. When the temple was rebuilt after the Babylonian exile, it was a relatively small structure. But King Herod the Great of Judea started expanding the structure in 20 BCE, 16 years before he died. Herod was a builder. He oversaw the construction of Herodium and Masada, both places we visited. He made the Jerusalem Temple into a monumental edifice. Construction continued long after Herod died, as we can see from the response Jesus got when he talked about the resurrection, the temple of his body. It has taken 46 years to build this temple, they said. We visited the western wall of the temple. It used to be known as the Wailing Wall. It's today a special place of prayer for Jews and Christians. The bottom 7 layers of large stones with beveled edges are original to the wall. The stones higher up were added later. It's traditional not just to pray at this location, but to write your prayer on a slip of paper and insert it into a crack in the wall, which I did too. The western wall of the temple was, for millennia, the only known remaining part of the temple after the Romans destroyed it in AD 70, so it's very special. The wall is on the right. The building on the left is more recent, and you can see smaller stones near the top of the wall that were later additions. There have been excavations going on since the 60s of the Temple Mount area, which have uncovered previously unknown parts of the temple. This is the southern side of the temple area. And here are the southern steps of the temple that lead up to the main entrance. Jesus would have undoubtedly walked on these very steps to enter the temple, at least on the old worn portions of the steps, which are original. There are also newer replacement stones. He may have taught standing on these very steps, which is why they're called the teaching steps. I myself did some teaching on these steps about the Pharisees, Sadducees, and other religious movements of the first century, while the group stood at the bottom of the steps. I found out afterwards, when I looked down, that I was standing on one of the old original slabs of stone, perhaps the very stone that Jesus himself stood on. The excavations also uncovered another outer wall of the temple, along with a first-century street, where Jesus and the disciples would most likely have walked. You can see that there are piles of rubble on this street. Once, when Jesus was at the Jerusalem temple, the disciples remarked on the large stones and monumental buildings. This led Jesus to predict the destruction of the temple with the stones thrown down. After the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70, at some point they then threw down huge stones from the temple buildings over the outer wall. This would not have been easy. They must have been extremely disdainful for the conquered Jews. So the Jerusalem temple, the holiest place in Israel, was destroyed. While we're on the topic of holy places, it's important to remember the incident that happened with Jesus on a high mountain. Peter, James, and John, the inner circle of disciples, were with him, and he was transfigured before them. It may have been a foretaste of his resurrection and exaltation. With him were Moses and Elijah, either representing the law and the prophets, or possibly because Elijah was taken bodily from earth without dying, and Jewish tradition said the same about Moses. The Bible just says that no one knows where his grave is. Well, Peter gets excited and says, "Lord, it is good for us to be here." I thought that about many of the places we visited in the Holy Land. Then Peter suggests that he could set up 3 tents or booths or tabernacles, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. This would memorialize the holy place. But a voice from heaven proclaimed, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Attending to Jesus and following his way is more important than memorializing a holy place. I said I would come back to Jacob's well and John 4. The conversation Jesus had with the Samaritan woman at the well has significant bearing on the issue of holy places. In the conversation, the woman mentions the mountain that our ancestors, the Samaritans, worshipped on, namely Mount Gerizim. This was the site of the Samaritan temple before it was destroyed in 128 BCE by John Hyrcanus, the Jewish high priest at the time. She says, "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain," that is Mount Gerizim, "but you, Jews, say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem, that is Mount Zion." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. The hour is coming and is now here when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." Does that mean that places are unimportant? Why then did we visit the Holy Land? Maybe the question to ask is, how do these holy places relate to the Christian calling to be holy people? After Jesus' resurrection, we're told that he came to his disciples and said to them, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And when he has said this, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Now, this episode in John's Gospel is equivalent to the account in Acts of the Holy Spirit coming upon the disciples in the upper room on the day of Pentecost. The important theological point which Paul makes in his letters is that the church, the people of God who Christ founded, is God's holy temple. The people are the dwelling place of God's Holy Spirit. Now you see why I entitled this reflection, Holy Places, Holy People. Jim noted that the Holy Land was so ordinary. Well, holy people are also very ordinary. And the incarnation was also quite ordinary. Yes, Jesus was born of a virgin, that's unusual, but he was born. He was gestated in Mary's womb and emerged after 9 months covered with vernix, and he grew up as a young boy in a rural village in Galilee and learned the trade of a tecton, a builder. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This makes the incarnation quite extraordinary. God meets us where we are, in this real, ordinary, crazy, but quite wonderful world. Our pilgrimage group consisted of about 40 people from all walks of life. Here's our entire group, including Bobby, our teacher, and Joseph, our Israeli guide, sitting in the center. Among the group were students who were taking a credit course that I taught based on our trip. There weren't a lot of assignments. Most of the course was just being on the trip. But students wrote a paper reflecting on the significance of the trip for their lives. One student wrote on the relevance of this trip to the incarnation, the Word made flesh. Being in the Holy Land and remembering the roots of my faith reinvigorated my sense of gratitude to be included in such a long lineage. Walking in places where Jesus himself very likely walked made me remember how important an incarnational faith is, how my God is a God who had meat and bones and probably had sore feet like I did after all the walking, who got hungry and tired on the long hikes like I did, who met fascinating people and talked and laughed with them just like I did on this journey. Jesus the man came more alive than ever to me during this trip in such an embodied, tactile, tangible, accessible way. One beautiful place we visited was the Mount of Beatitudes, though this spot is probably more traditional than historical. This may not have been the exact mountain where Jesus taught the Beatitudes as part of the Sermon on the Mount, but it is a likely location. We had a communion service on the Mount of Beatitudes. It was a very windy day. You could say that the Spirit, the Ruach, was moving in our midst. I led parts of the service, along with our teacher from the Jerusalem Center for Biblical Studies, Bobby Morris. A student later reflected on the experience. I was moved to tears by the beauty of what our gathering represented. We were a group of over 40 people with homelands literally all around the world. We were from all ages and stages of life, and every single one of us came to the table of the Lord. Scott, a local pastor from Rochester, was the official celebrant. Everyone in the group, people from 18 to 87 years old, from the USA, Canada, South Africa, Jamaica, Slovakia, and Norway, participated in the Eucharist. Even our Israeli guide, a Christian from East Jerusalem, took communion with us for the first time in 18 years, he told us. The student went on to say, it was a gorgeous depiction of what the kingdom of God is supposed to look like. Our time on the Mount of Beatitudes gave me what I believe is a prophetic message for God's church today. It helped me reflect on and repent of all the ways I have not practiced inclusivity in my own theology. And it reignited a passion in me to preach God's immense, wide-reaching welcome of saving mercy to everyone willing to hear it. I left the Holy Land with a revitalization, not only in my own personal faith, but also my sense of mission for my pastoral call. I owe Northeastern Seminary, the instructors and guides, and every single person I met in Israel and Palestine a world of gratitude, for this journey has indeed changed me forever. So our pilgrimage starts with the Holy Land as we connect with special places mentioned in the Bible, helping us to get a sense of the historical and geographical roots of our faith. But the pilgrimage doesn't end when we return home. We have set off on a journey that continues into the ordinary places we return to, anywhere we go. Indeed, the ordinary places we go can be sanctified by our presence there, by the way we, God's holy people, live. After all, this ordinary world was sanctified by the coming of God into it, throughout the history of Israel and ultimately in the person of Jesus. It's all so very ordinary, but God meets us where we are, and we're going to the Holy Land again for another 2-week pilgrimage a few days after Christmas this year. You're invited to join us. Registration is now open. To find out more about the trip or to register, you can scan the code here with your smartphone, which takes you directly to the Jerusalem Center for Biblical Studies website. And then you can use the information in the bottom left corner of this slide to find the Northeastern Seminary trip. Or you can go directly to the link here for our trip on the Jerusalem Center website. And you can also download from the website a PDF of the brochure with the itinerary. It doesn't matter whether you're traveling from within the U.S. or from another country, we can work it out. It also doesn't matter if you just want to come on the trip for fun or if you want to actually use the trip as the basis for a credit course offered by Northeastern Seminary. You don't even have to be a Northeastern Seminary student to take the course. Students from other institutions and other countries have taken the course. You can take the course for graduate credit or for undergraduate credit if that's what you need, and you can transfer the credits to whatever program of study you're currently in. Just contact me at the email listed here if you want to find out more, and I'd be happy to send you a syllabus and answer your questions about what the course involves. Or you can contact the seminary directly about course registration. Whether or not you're joining us on this trip to the Holy Land, I hope that this reflection on holy places, holy people, was helpful to you in thinking about your own pilgrimage, your journey of faith. Wishing you blessings in Hebrew, brachot, and peace. Shalom.